Alright, so I was under the assumption that I was never going to cover The Last of Us ever again on account of the fact that it's nothing more than an invitation for toxicity, and even then it's not even the type of toxicity that gets a lot of views. Besides, what's even the point? The people who hate it will hate it, the people who like it will like it. But I feel like my hand was sort of forced in this instance. It was episode 4 that actually gave me a sudden burst of inspiration to actually cover this season. And in spite of the fact that the last 3 episodes were actually better, that still didn't really change my opinion, and my opinion is that season 2 of The Last of Us show was just not very good. I have been made increasingly aware of the fact that it fails on a fundamental level. Now, I just want to preface this by saying, if you're coming here expecting me to rant about gay people or whatever, then you've come in the wrong door. That has absolutely no bearing on my opinion whatsoever. As a matter of fact, I think the Dina-Ellie relationship is one of the more redeeming aspects of this season, so if you want to hate on the series for that reason, we are not the same, please see yourself out. I'd say keep it civil, but this is The Last of Us. So to give you an idea of my relationship with The Last of Us, I like the first game. I don't love it in the same way that many others have. I think it's a solid game with a simple but well-told story elevated by a spectacular ending. As far as the gameplay is concerned, it doesn't necessarily do anything new, but it does everything well. As for the second game, I hated it for about 2 years, then I played it. That's not me making a joke, that's what happened. Like many people, I hated it on principle based on hearsay and not my own experiences. After playing it, in spite of the fact that it's by far the most controversial and divisive game of all time, and that's an inarguable fact, I have a complicated but generally positive relationship with it. I went in with an open mind, I let it take me on whatever story it wanted to tell, and by the end I had generally positive opinions on it in spite of some issues. Even though I largely knew what was going to happen, I didn't have any preconceived notions about what I expected or wanted to feel. I put everything aside that I'd heard about it and let it dictate the journey, and the end result was, pretty much one thumbs up. I'm fully aware of the fact that it's one of those games that many people hate with such unrelenting venom that anything less than unconditional hatred makes you a shill. I've quite literally been accused of being paid off by Naughty Dog for this video. To put that in perspective, that was a video that came out when the game was almost 3 years old to an audience of maybe 40 or 50,000 people at the time, and I spent half the video criticizing the game. Try for a second to understand how much you have to utterly despise something to think that's a service that a company would pay for. To think the game is so objectively bad that the only possible explanation that somebody didn't hate it as much as you is because they were paid off, even if it makes no sense. That's the level we're at. So it's with that in mind that I say The Last of Us Season 2, aka the TV adaptation of the first half of The Last of Us Part 2, kind of doesn't work. In fact, I would go as far as to say it's a flop. You see, the reason that I came to realize this season sort of doesn't work was largely because of the structure of the story. I'm not even kidding when I say I got up to the end of episode 4 and actually found myself frustrated because, to me, it finally felt like the series was primed to start picking up. We were starting to get a little bit of momentum, and then the episode just ended. And I'm like, seriously? That's it? Again? This is the 3rd time this has happened. You see, episode 1 is the calm before the storm, and of the character building episodes, this is probably the best one. We see that after 5 years, both Ellie and Joel have settled into a domestic lifestyle. Joel is the head foreman of the town as they're attempting to expand their operations and expand their services, and the whole thing is basically just the day before the big day.
We gotta get things ready for the big day, big day. We gotta get things ready for the special day.
Which was all flashbacks in the game. The highlight of this segment for me is Catherine O'Hara as Gale. Catherine O'Hara is awesome, and I loved Home Alone growing up, so this was a treat for me.
Psychiatrists are the pill ones. And no, we're not allowed to drink in these things, but I woke up this morning feeling sad.
Episode 2 was really good. In fact, I would argue it's among some of the best episodes of the entire show so far. And that's why I was willing to deal with the setup episode that was episode 1, because episode 2 was not only that scene, the most controversial scene perhaps in video game history, but it was also punctuated by the assault on Jackson, an impeccable action scene of the town being overrun by infected. Just absolutely stupendous in every possible way. By far the best and most intense action scene the series has yet seen, and it's not even close. And it actually took some balls, because even in the games, they never went as far as to have Jackson be overrun. I'm sure they're saving that for the 3rd game. But they went there. They really did. So they had that, and then across the valley they had Joel getting beaten to death, and it was very gripping. But that was the only episode I really felt actually hit those heights that the show really needed to hit, and I will give them an allowance on the fact that it's a very big deal that they killed off the main character, therefore they needed an episode beforehand to build it up, and they needed another episode afterwards to pay it off and come down from it, hence episode 3. Once again, there's some good drama here, good character acting, and I really like the expansion of Dina in this show. I wasn't a fan of hers in the game, always felt like a bit of a charisma vacuum. But here, they give her an established relationship with Joel in order to give her more of a reason to go on the journey, and they also put her in that scene instead of Tommy because Tommy was holding down Jackson. I honestly think the scene is better for it. Abby threatens to kill Dina if they don't cooperate at one point, and given that she's the most innocent party of everyone, it makes the whole scene that much more tragic. And it also makes Abby come across as that much more monstrous when even her crew is questioning her. Plus, Isabella Merced is great as Dina. Great actress, great human being, and my god, she's attractive. Despite being the emotional come down, I felt that episode 3 really needed to get into the action by the end because the viewers really needed some emotional catharsis after the previous episode. I guess it wasn't necessary, but it ends right as we're getting into what could potentially be the action, so that's 2 relatively plodding episodes where you're dealing with characters, which is fine, but at the same time, nothing of substance is really happening during this. And then episode 4 comes along, and I was hoping they were going to do something explosive to ride us back up to that high we had in episode 2. Something both exciting and consequential, but that wouldn't be so. Basically, nothing of substance actually happened in this episode as far as progressing the main plot. You had a side plot of Dina revealing that she's pregnant, you had a demonstration of the ruthlessness of the Seraphites, and you had a rather disturbing introduction to the character of Isaac. Also, the full frontal male nudity certainly took me off guard. These things are all fine, except for the full frontal male nudity, but none of it is the main plot, and I couldn't help but feel the actual main plot was moving at a snail's pace by this point, and really, when you think about it, as far as Ellie's story, there isn't actually much to her story. She tracks down her surrogate father's killers one by one and kills them each in an increasingly disturbing escalation of violence that starts to make you question whether or not she was in the right. And I feel like that works as a game because the main beats can be connected by the interactive elements, but when you strip the interactive elements from that, the story is actually not that robust. Meaning that without the action, the story feels oddly padded. You want to know when I really started to notice this? It was in the music shop scene. This was a great scene in the game, don't get me wrong. Ellie finds a guitar and plays Take On Me, but that's a 3-minute segment of a 20-hour game, in and amongst a chunk of the game where we're already dealing with a ton of infected. When they got to this part of the show, I was convinced they were probably just gonna sing the first verse or two, but then she goes through the entire song, and I feel like you didn't have to play the entire song to get the point across. I was looking at my phone by the end of this, and it really made me realize the season had no urgency to it. It didn't feel like a do-or-die revenge quest in hostile lands, it felt like a sightseeing tour, both in pace as well as Ellie's lack of animosity during this chunk, and even then, even when the action did pick up in that episode, I will admit, spectacular as it was visually, I couldn't help but feel the whole scene felt a bit pointless. Because the only thing of substance to the overall story that actually happened was that it established Ellie being immune to Dina. Conversely, Dina admitting she was pregnant. And this led to a night of spontaneous passion. But did that really need an entire episode's worth of story to establish? Like I said, they also used the scene to illustrate that the Seraphites are potentially just as bad as the WLF, maybe even worse, but the fact this scene was so void of an actual point to the overall story, and because what little point there was came after a significant amount of time in that situation, I couldn't help but feel this entire action sequence meant nothing to me. Of course, then there's the Isaac subplot, which resulted in the cool intro where we get to see Josh Peck get blown to pieces. Presumably, this was an elaborate prank by Megan, but I couldn't help but find myself not getting invested in the Isaac story because I know for a damn fact that that's not going to get any payoff until season 3. Until they tell Abby's story, it's tangential at best. Listen, I went into this season with all the goodwill in the world, so just imagine how boring episodes 3 and 4 had to be for the goodwill to go by the wayside. That's the thing, the show itself is not shot poorly, it's not edited poorly, it's not acted poorly. There's all of maybe one shooting mistake in the entire season, but it was just so boring up to this point, and I spent my time waiting for something to actually happen. Much like the game, they're kind of expecting the audience to hate Abby so much that they're willing to go through the slow parts to get there, but without gameplay, the slow parts feel so much more slow. And the funny thing is, in spite of all the nothing that was happening by this point, they still had to cut a lot of potentially good moments from the game. But the question is, does the show actually pick up after this? Yes and no. Episode 5 finally gave me what I was looking for, some goddamn progression to the story, but it took more than half the episode. Up until about the 23-minute mark, I was sitting there looking at my watch waiting for something to happen. The most exciting thing to happen was Dina explaining her backstory, and the more I see of this season, the more I realize that Isabella Merced better be careful not to herniate a disc with how hard she's carrying the season. The moment things actually pick up is when Jesse finally gets involved. Literally, he joins in and suddenly the episode gets awesome. You got an action scene with the infected, an action scene with the scars, which included a moment so grotesque I refused to even look at the screen. Which I say with no shame whatsoever, and mercy of all mercies, we finally get to the hospital. Then we not only get to see Nora, but also the spores, and the scene where Ellie tortures Nora is everything I wanted. You can actually visibly see it in her face when Ellie snaps. So we finally had something happen, but it took way too long to get there, and based on the epilogue scene, we knew that episode 6 was going to be the designated flashback episode. Where these happened sporadically throughout the game, they decided to make one episode where everything that needed to be exposited to the audience was exposited to the audience. I knew that episode 6 was going to be a compelling character episode, but it was going to be yet another episode where nothing of substance to the relevant plot happened. It'll be a whole episode of build-up to Ellie finding out, and whether or not you're forgiving of that depends on how much you like the duo from the first season, and to be fair, I did. But I had a sense that this episode was probably going to prove why the flashbacks didn't happen all at once in the game, and I was proven correct to a certain degree. I enjoyed this episode pretty much as I thought I was going to, because as with the flashbacks in the game, it's a series of happy times that gradually fades into the unhappy times as Ellie grows up and gains a degree of independence from Joel, and also gradually gains the courage to stand up to him for his lying. The whole episode is caked in dramatic irony, knowing that Joel is already dead, so none of this really matters. But as I suspected, by ripping these scenes out of their original context and bunching them all together, it robs them of their emotional weight in a sense. Because showing them piecemeal throughout the narrative is supposed to serve to help contextualize what the character is feeling in that point in their journey by mirroring it with a relevant past event, and it also means that the player doesn't quite know what was up at any given point. It's a pushing and pulling, so you're never quite aware of where Joel and Ellie stood by the end. For a good chunk of the game, we didn't even know if Ellie knew what happened, but in this case, we find out that she knew before a single flashback took place.
That's what he did. I know.
Completely kneecapping the big mystery, and I think they committed an egregious sin in that they combined the scenes where Joel finally tells her the truth with the "I don't think I can ever forgive you for that, but I would like to try" scene, and I thought, oh, fumbling the ball at the 1-yard line, because that scene took place at the end of the story because that was the payoff to the aforementioned mystery. And that scene was supposed to play at the end at the same time that Ellie had the last remnants of Joel ripped away from her, and she decides the only thing she can do is move on with her life. It was essentially bookending itself by showing the conclusion to both stories and the start of a new journey. It was important in that way, and while I generally got out of that episode what I wanted, quite frankly, I'm wondering if the flashbacks could have been used as cold opens. You know, instead of having a dedicated flashback episode. Then again, it would have gotten in the way of the actual cold opens, and the actual cold opens were really good, especially this one, showing the parallels of Joel to his own father, who was a very traditional spare the rod, spoil the child style parent. So I don't know, I'm the type of person who believes that if you can justify narrative changes, then I can buy it, but I struggle to really understand either the changes or how the story has been told overall. Yeah, I had plenty of issues with the game's story, but at this point I realize this is taking the things that worked and rearranging them so they don't work. To what degree they don't work is just down to how charitable you are. All I know is after this, we only had the season finale, and to be honest, this episode really didn't change my mind. The first thing I noticed in this episode was that while the opening scene was dramatically sound, it really was the final nail that illustrated something that was brought up to me. How they really handheld the audience in certain instances. Ellie says outright that maybe Nora didn't deserve what she got, when based on the drama, you should be able to trust the audience to come to that conclusion themselves.
Yeah, well, maybe she got what she deserved. Maybe she didn't.
This happened multiple times throughout the season, where they came out and just said something that could have easily been inferred by the audience. But ultimately, this episode still has the same issues that other episodes had, where it's a lot of build-up and not a lot of payoff. And in this case, even though it's the payoff to the season, it's not paid off because it's paid off in a different story. They do attempt to tangentially tie in the Seraphite Island invasion into Ellie's story by having her briefly shipwrecked on the Seraphite Island. That was a great subversion. I was not expecting that, but it's a hot bucket of nothing because it lasts all of 30 seconds. They briefly tease that they're gonna kill her, then the island invasion happens somewhere off screen, so they let her go.
12 seconds later.
What the hell was that?
The highlight is definitely Owen and Mel's death scene. Mel was already positioned as the most innocent party of their entire troop, and now they make that more apparent by making Ellie kill her completely on accident. A bullet goes through Owen and catches her in the neck. And she's not even necessarily aggrieved, she's just begging Ellie to cut out the baby before both of them die. But Ellie's not able to. Man, that was a gut-wrenching scene, especially with the knowledge that Mel wanted no part of any of this. But naturally, the season ends just as the first half of the game ends. Abby breaks into the theater, cut to black. Only we get a brief tease of Abby's story being season 3 because they show her waking up with the big plain text indicator of Seattle Day 1. So I feel the same way at the end of episode 7 as I did at the end of episode 4, kinda frustrated. Yeah, the season does pick up by the end, but that doesn't really change the fact that 4 or possibly 5 out of the 7 episodes were boring as fuck. Not only that, but padded to hell. Ultimately building to something that never really got paid off. And it got me thinking, what is it about this season that doesn't work? You know, compared to the first season. To be clear, I love season 1. Genuinely one of the best seasons of television I've ever watched, and I will not apologize for that opinion. But I feel like the reason that The Last of Us season 1 works, at least for me, was the fact that because it happened over the course of a year and every episode was a different part of the game, and therefore every episode could be in a completely different location telling a completely different story, there were multiple different varied stories along a single journey. The fact that it's an ever-evolving story means that they keep it fresh for every episode, with one exception, and that was episode 4 of season 1. Because episode 4 is the prelude to episode 5, and together those two episodes are fantastic, but individually, episode 4 is nothing but setup and some decent character work as well, and while it was arguably the worst part of season 1, it's just one episode of the 8. Meanwhile, half of season 2 felt like episode 4, setting things up but not paying them off, because they're all continual chunks of the exact same story. There are good scenes within these episodes, but the overarching plot is just continual pieces of the exact same story, and the entire time I was sitting there wondering when we're gonna get to the fireworks factory, so to speak. And then it occurred to me, that's where structurally speaking the second game has difficulty in an adaptation. Because it is one continuous story as opposed to several stories with an overarching connecting element. That's why inherently this season lacks freshness, because it's the exact same story with the exact same characters in the exact same locations and doesn't have the ability to do anything new from episode to episode. It's relying on that structuring, which is why it feels so staid. Love the game or hate it, and I know many of you hate it, even some of you who've played the game, The Last of Us 2 just does not translate well to TV, because it's a very non-standard story that kind of relies on the fact that it is a video game to tell its story. Especially in the Ellie portion, there's not a lot of major beats, they're just spaced out with gameplay, and I never really noticed that the plot was spaced out because of that. And I feel like that was deliberate because they wanted to have the story feel very small and intimate, and then gradually open up the perspective and broaden the scope to make the game feel like a much bigger deal than it did at first. Plus, I was initially on board with them making the roster of aggressors smaller, you know, remove the dead weight so you can boil Abby's crew down to the people who matter. And to be fair, I barely even remember Jordan, and I definitely don't remember Nick. But like, you immediately killed one of the people responsible on the very first day. That actually matters to the progression of the story, and removing it inadvertently creates much more dead space, and it makes the whole season feel sort of inconsequential for a lot of it. The first 2 episodes were good, but the major plot is patchy, slow-moving, and ultimately doesn't get resolved because it was always going to end on that cliffhanger. I remember going into this season, I was wondering how they were going to handle the structuring of the story, considering I didn't think the audience was going to be receptive to having to wait a whole year and change just to get the resolution to this moment. That's expecting a lot out of the audience when you're ostensibly telling two completely different stories over two completely different seasons instead of one cohesive entry in a single piece of media. That wasn't an issue with the game because the cliffhanger happened in the middle, and then you got the rest of the game immediately after. The only way you weren't going to get a resolution to that is if you stopped playing, which some did. I never thought it was a good idea to tell the story in the same way that the game did, because that just doesn't work. It's just not conducive to a TV audience. A TV audience may have been more accepting of the idea that they killed Joel on account of TV deaths being more common, but because of the hard time limit that TV has, you had to alter the story to make it more palatable structure-wise. I don't think the audience is going to be very receptive of having to wait just to hear a story of a character they've been conditioned not to like, especially as an entirely separately produced entity from the story so far. And then apparently there's also the possibility of them trying to stretch it into a fourth season, and I'm like, no, just hell no. What are you doing? Are you going to stretch The Farm and Santa Barbara into a whole season? That's insane. That's maybe 2 episodes max. But then I'm looking at the story that we got, and it occurs to me that they probably could have cut this season down to 6 or even 5 episodes. I feel like they could have combined episodes 3 and 4 into one episode in the same way they combined Jackson and Colorado into one episode in season 1. Then maybe they could have pared things down by another episode by combining certain bits. I feel like they could have cut episode 6 into episodes 3, 4, and then maybe 5. Maybe even have the 15th birthday scene in episode 2. Then they could theoretically do Abby's story in 5 or 6 episodes as well. If hypothetically HBO would be down with giving them a budget for a longer season, they could have done a mid-season break to separate the 2 episodes without making the audience wait an extra year and a half, and then finish both stories in 10 episodes. Then make The Farm and Santa Barbara 2 episodes or maybe 1 extra long episode, and bam, you've told the entire story. I don't know. I think this whole thing was a mistake. I don't think it's a mistake in the sense that they shouldn't have told the story to begin with, because I'm one of those sad sacks who actually found the second game's story effective, if flawed. So I'm not in favor of them overhauling it, or making it some sort of safe, boring story to appease some people who probably weren't fans to begin with. And quite frankly, if Stellar Blade taught me anything, some people just want to be angry. But I think they should have done a better job at adapting this to TV. I feel like there were probably a bunch of ways they could have improved on the story in an adaptation, but they kind of went with the absolute worst telling of the story. It's almost like everything that should have been changed wasn't changed, and everything that shouldn't have been changed was changed. It's like they got their notes mixed up or something. And I don't know, as I sit here thinking about season 1, there were so many good scenes that I could go back to again and again. But not only did I find this season so boring that it wasted all my goodwill, I don't even think there's a single scene in this entire season that I would go back to and watch in isolation outside of episode 2. Like, yeah, with all due respect to Craig Mazin, he can talk about all these deliberate artistic choices they made, and I'm sure they were well thought out, but I don't think it was an artistic choice to make this season just boring for 80% of it. Perhaps I am being a bit too cynical here, but that's because they tested my patience, and if I give you the benefit of the doubt and you test my patience, suddenly I'm gonna hold you to a lot higher scrutiny. And season 2 of The Last of Us just lost me. I'd like to think I'm a calm and reasonable person who's not too hard to please. I go into things in good faith intending to like them, because why should I make myself mad in my own home? Some people revel in anger, and I'm not one of those people. Anger is such a pointless emotion. I'm not mad, I'm just disappointed. That's all I've got. If you like this video and want to support the channel, please consider liking this video, leaving a comment telling me what you think, subscribing, and hitting the notification icon so you're always up to date on what I'm doing. And if you want to support the channel in a more direct fashion, you can pledge to my Patreon for unique perks and rewards such as early access, Discord benefits, and exclusive content along with these fine folks right here. And an extra special thank you to Dick Kickham, Ga004, Hydra Overlord, My Name is Tank, FarmCat84, Raph, Ranger X, Sphinx, Weird Webster, and Will Stokes for going above and beyond. I've been the King of Snark Style right here on Tactical Bacon Productions, and I will see you next time. Stay crispy, my friends.